Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Tony Gates. Most of you guys already know me. I work at Developer Network. Pretty much facilitate acting as a proxy between you and the community and SuperOffice R&D. On a very regular basis, I often find myself collecting information from individuals just like yourself and bringing that sort of feedback down in R&D and trying to get some solutions to certain problems. I myself am not an absolute genius in every aspect, every shadow of all of the APIs, so I have absolutely good relationships and confidence in SuperOffice R&D and have the ability to approach them and get some solid answers for you guys at any time. At the same time, obviously I take whatever gold that they create, all this alchemist, and then share that with the community, put that out there, write the articles, create the videos, and show that to you. You can reach me on various handles, Twitter, blogging, Facebook, what have you. You can go ahead and write to me and ask me questions there if you feel my email is not getting to you fast enough, or if my phone call is not answering you yet, or some other way in order to contact me. Obviously, the DevNet forums is the primary means to get a hold of me or anybody else in the community to help you solve your problems, and hopefully that's been a success story. Tomorrow I got a little bit of insight. I'm just going to kind of plug tomorrow's session a little bit to tell you about a little bit of a preview about what's going to happen with DevNet in the future and the community projects that I'm currently working on. A little pizzazz, so let's get the party started. In this session, pretty much what I want to cover is what are the archive controls and the archive providers, basically breaking it down to what's the archive system. I want to show you what that is. I want to show you when it's appropriate to use it, basically what is the expected sort of workflow. We want to go ahead and talk about how it all works together, what are the moving parts and how do those moving parts fit together, what are the dependencies, where do they go, those sort of things. Then we're going to talk a little bit about future ambitions, a little bit about where we want to see this going. There's a lot of changes that you saw this morning in the future of the platform, and the archive system is hopefully not without some additions to it. Two main pieces of this puzzle. Basically, the archive providers are made up of the archive system is made up of the archive providers and the archive controls that actually populate the data provided by these archive controllers. Archive providers. I'm going to get this all screwed. The archive control has been around for a long, long time, right? And inside SuperOffice, it's a fixture. So all those grid controls that you see that you work with, all the information, they're not editable. It's just read-only information that you can take action upon, click or signal click, in order to invoke some sort of action within the platform. Archive providers, on the other hand, they haven't been an extensive piece of the puzzle for that long. It was first introduced in November of 2007 in NetServer 3.0. So, in the last few years, that's come quite a long ways. We've got a lot more experience, a lot more tread has been driven down that road, has been taking advantage of using those sort of systems, those mechanisms inside SuperOffice to get information and being able to display information. And that's a very important point to make, that archive providers are specifically for reading information only. Right, so keep that in mind. The web client integration, the web client was the first platform in order to take advantage of these archive providers. Right? The archive controls throughout the entire web client is driven by archive providers. This means every grid control that you see, archive control. Every list that you see, this does not include MDO list. MDO, the combo boxes, those are not archive driven, those are MDO providers. But all the lists that you might see in the preview in the mini panel are take a look about where you see those here. Archive controls populated by archive providers. So, in every scenario, when you're going to take advantage of archive providers or the archive system, you have to have some sort of data source. Whether it's made up or coming from the cloud or coming from a file system or a database. You can aggregate information from anywhere, right? If you can get access to data, what is development fundamentally? You're getting information, you're transforming it, and then iterating through it, or iterating through it, transforming it, and persisting it somewhere. And this is a very similar system. You're basically getting data from somewhere and transforming it into a format that the archive controls understand. And archive controls understand columns and data, archive data, archive rows. That's the job of an archive provider, is to get that information from wherever it be, transform it into basically rows of information, and then allow the control to display it. Now when it comes into the archive control, there are various things that we can do with it. Let's see. The first thing we want to talk about is in the web client. We'll see the actions that we can take upon each one of these. Whenever you click on one of the rows, you invoke a specific action. And today you notice in the Windows application as the current system. The web application has the same exact thing. So when you click on a row, you update currents. They're all relevant within that row. That row always contains information about some specific entity. And when I say entity, I mean person or document or sale, things of that nature. These can also include things that you create, invoice, product, what have you. We're going to explore how we can work with this information a little bit more in detail as we continue on. So single-click operations update the current system. Double-click operations, these are used in order to work with the SuperOffice kind of data workflow. What happens when you double-click on a row? Always, it opens up a dialog. Right? This is the SuperOffice data model, the way that you interact with information. You don't interact with it actually in the row, you act and operate against it inside the dialogues. A lot of people like to take advantage of web panels. And in web panels, you can pretty much do anything you want. You hook up a web panel, oh my God, jQuery's out there. Woohoo! I got the world at my fingertips. You make everything look nice and slick, inline edited in the grid controls and whatever, popping up things. That's not the SuperOffice data workflow. The SuperOffice data workflow is clicking on a row, opening a dialog, and having a richer user experience of working with that information. Now, if we incorporate that same sort of mindset when new users take advantage of your integrations, they're going to have, it's all going to feel right at home. They're going to have a seamless, integrated experience. Sorry? Right, so the question was, does this apply to web as well? The answer is yes, very much so. It's easier, in fact, to create dialogues, to interact with information after you double-click in a row in the web world. It's basically markup. The SOML, SuperOffice markup language, you make one of those pages, and then we'll get a little bit more into how you open up that dialogue from a double-click operation in both the Win and specifically the web world. A little bit later in this talk, I want to kind of emphasize about where we have come with invocation actions against the information that's contained within these archive controls. But we can go ahead and touch on these points. If at some point in this talk I no longer am talking about web and I didn't answer that question, please ask again and remind me, and I'll come back and show it to you. Context menus. You can create your own context menus and have the ability to invoke actions with them as well. In the current implementation of the Windows client, you can have submenus, and I'm going to show you how you can do that. However, in 7.0, the initial release, you were not able to do that. Neither are you able to do that in the web world. Yes. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about those submenus as well, and then you can create actions that you can take behind each one of those clicks as well. Toolbars, you can add toolbars on the button as well. Same thing. Everything that I'm talking about right now, specifically for the web, I've added a little bit more information about Windows. The entity filters, where you can click the checkbox in order to filter out information that you see within the context of the archive control. You can do that. That is basically embedded, or bubbles up, if you will, from the archive provider. In the archive provider, you say what this archive provider is actually going to give you. Is it going to give you a sale? Is it going to give you an appointment? Is it going to give you a document? Is it going to give you an invoice? Is it going to give you a product? That's an entity. And when you click this checkbox, it will basically re-invoke that archive provider where the mechanisms or the code within that archive provider needs to explicitly look to see if this entity is being requested. If it is, it will be included in the result set. If you are clicking on that checkbox, you are asking for that information, and it will give it to you. So looking at the Windows world, it provides exactly the same thing. However, the underlying infrastructure on how they work is similar but different, and we're going to explore that as well. So when we're looking at the web client is a monstrosity of configuration files. Everyone here knows that, right? Lots of configuration files, and with configuration, right, comes power, capability, flexibility. But there is a learning curve, without a doubt, about where everything is stored. So I want to talk about where those things are stored. When you're going to create an archive control and host that inside the web client, you need to think about a few different types of files. The first one is basically going to define what columns are available for you to put inside that archive control. When you right-click on the header and say, configure columns, what columns do I have to choose from to show inside that control? And then those specific columns that come up in that list are defined inside the SO columns, SO archive column list configuration file. When you invoke an action, you're specifically saying a click or a double-click operation. Those actions are basically executed in JavaScript inside the web client. And we define those methods, what's going to happen when we single-click, what currents we want to update, and then what happens or what dialog we want to appear, or where do we want to navigate to inside the client when we double-click. And that information is stored inside the SO archive control link info types configuration file. I'm not even going to show you this. I don't want to scare you to death. But it's, again, configurability, power. Now, if you're going to be opening up, or actually including your SO archive control, your SO control, inside the web client, it can be in the contact panel. You want to add in a new tab that has the archive control. You're going to have to modify the SO contact page, for example, if you want to have it inside the contact page. If you want to have it inside the project panel in the archives card, then you're going to want to modify the SO project page, which bubbles down to panels and cards and things like that. Eventually get down to the actual controls. To the context menus. Context menus are menu controls, basically. So when we're talking about categorization and where we categorize things, they're cataloged underneath a menu system. So we put that information inside the SO menu configuration config file and specifically specify there are basically two keys that control the actions that are going to be listed for the context menu. It's called a context and a subcontext. And always, 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 when it's going to be for an archive control, the context is going to start with archive. And then the subcontext is going to be, I'm introducing new terms here, I understand this. We'll get more into that. But it's called the GUI name. And these are basically keys that allow us to better catalog where those menus are being stored and also how they can be retrieved. Yeah. For the toolbars, those are created in markup directly in the SO archive controls config section. Again, that's in the page. And then the entities, as I said before, are coded directly inside the archive control. Every archive control provides one or more entities, one or more models, one or more real-world objects, persons, documents, sales, those sort of things, and allows you to select from that. Windows client. Yeah, I'm almost behind. Three things that we have in common. Custom archive configuration, config file, is a config file that can be named anything, but it's going to be stored inside the installation folder of where SuperOffice is. And it's going to be a new folder, and it's called SOCRM space custom space configs. Let me just point that out. I'll show you that. So here's the installation folder of SuperOffice, and here's this SOCRM custom archives folder. And inside here is where I am going to store those archive controls, or yes, the archive control configurations, definitions. Okay, we're going to take a look at that, but also talk about the event handlers, because how do you invoke an action? You specify inside this configuration file what action you can take by giving it a method name that's defined inside the script files. SLCRM loads up, and it loads up the script files from each user's scripts folder, right? And then you can define event handlers, for example, when the document dialog is shown or when the appointment dialog is shown. Now you can also put in your custom methods that will be invoked that you specify inside the configuration file. And basically that's how we look this up. I'm going to show you an example of this. I'm going to show you some XML. Stay with me. And again, entities coded in the archive provider. Where are the entities defined? They're still alive. Entities are defined in the archive provider. Thank you, Patrick. So here's some XML. Ah, no! There's a whole lot of XML. All right. So this is the configuration file, the custom configuration file that you would specify for the Windows client in SuperOffice 7.0. In here, we have the provider name, which says, where am I getting that information from, right? Who's going to populate this control? And then the GUI name allows me to give it sort of an identifier, to say that this control is called this name, it's a GUI name. And then the host name specifies where in my SuperOffice application I want this to be hosted. Provider name is where am I getting my data. The GUI name specifies the actual control itself. And then the host name is where I want that to actually be hosted inside Windows. It can be the contact archive, so that it comes down in the contact card, the contact activities card, and you tap down there. It can actually be hosted up above. It can be put into the mini panels. It can be put into selections. It can be put into projects. It can be put into diary archives. we've got it so it can go pretty much everywhere. I'm not going to list basically all of the possible host names because it's well documented. It's in the SDK. There's a good article about it on the developer network. So just go search for archive control and you'll find it. So custom. Custom is where we define the aspects or the properties of this control. Now what is the storage key? What's the window name? The window name is actually going to be what's displayed inside on the tab. And then you have the protocol, which if I want to use SO protocol in order to show my tab from some other panel, then I can do that and address that control directly. The edit method is the method that I name this, and I can call it anything, but if I put a method called onEditTweet inside my VB or JavaScript file from the script engine, when I click on the edit button or double click, it's going to invoke that edit method. And inside there is my opportunity to capture the parameters, which are definable, and also show a dialog, invoke that information in a rich user way, and be able to manipulate it, and then persist the changes, and then return control to the archive control. Add method name, same thing. If I place a method called onAddTweet inside my VB script file, that's the method that's going to be invoked when I click on the add button. Delete method, same. Context menu method, pretty much for all of the context menus that I defined a little bit farther down below, underneath restrictions and view and toolbar, there's the context menu items. I can specify a method that's called when I click on that item in that context menu. What's passed into me is the name or the ID that I give it inside the configuration menu items element. Yeah, it's a little bit twisted. Underneath there, we have the tooltip, where you can show up a tooltip when you hover over the tab. Restrictions. This is a configurable section that you can pass in any restrictions you want to the provider so that you can filter the information that it gives you. You can hard-code this, but you can also put in template variables based on the current system. So you get relevant information based on the context of where you are. Let's see. There are a few new restrictions that are possible. We'll talk about those coming very soon. Yes. Okay. The view, you can specify what the view looks like. You have some additional options for debugging. In order to enable this functionality, you have to go inside SOAdmin and show or enable a developer mode for SuperOffice underneath the functions. So we're going to show you that. So here we are inside SOAdmin. I'm underneath the functions, preferences, functions. Down here towards the bottom, there's enable developer mode for custom archives. And I have it enabled for myself. What does this do? Well, it does a few things actually. But primarily, it shows me a debug dialog inside my SOCR application, where I can use this to troubleshoot archive controls. And we're going to come back to this a little bit, just a little bit. Because you're in the Windows control, or inside the Windows client, several times, or a couple versions ago, when you're troubleshooting scripts, you make small changes to the script. Then you'd have to shut down the application, and then restart the application and see if your changes actually gave you the result that you expected. Reconfigure columns is the exact same thing, but now you don't have to close the Windows client. It's just like kind of refreshing the script now that you can do inside the Windows client. You can refresh the configurations. Anytime I make a change to the configuration file, this XML file, I can right-click on the archive control, choose reconfigure, and it will reload all of my changes. So I don't have to restart SuperOffice to see those things. The Field Data Viewer is a very useful tool for showing you the information that is provided to you from the archive provider. It talks about everything you would possibly want to know about that data that's being sent back to you. What's the archive? How's it configured? What entities it's going to give you? What are the formatting of all of the different data types? Basically, unlimited information, all of the information that you could possibly want to know about. I'll show you that actually in action. And then finally, down below the context menu items, we have the columns. The column definitions for when I right-click and choose configure columns. What columns are going to be displayed for me available to bring information in? All of this will basically change based on your archive provider. So every archive provider has a well-defined list of columns that can be used, and then based on those column definitions is what you'll replicate inside this configuration file so that can be shown inside Windows. So the actual invocation of this archive system inside the Windows client using scripts, basically this is the workflow. First you get a data source that's calling and invoking an archive provider, where you load the control, it's invoking the archive provider, and it's grabbing the information from the data source. When you click an action outside that archive control, it's going to look up and find those methods that we defined in that XML file, that configuration file, invoke that action, give you the ability to take action, and then persist those changes to the database, create new information, or delete information. And then the control will be returned back to the script, ultimately to the archive provider, and return a value. This is important. Have you ever been able to return a value inside a script before? No. They're all declared as subs, right? Sub whatever, end sub. That's all we've ever seen. Now, the methods that you define inside that configuration file, they will not work if you define them as subs, because they return values. In that case, they're called function. Function, end function. And whatever you do in between those statements is what will execute when you take action. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've introduced inside SuperOffice 7.0 SR1. We've included a new interface inside the archive system. You're going to find this inside SuperOffice.crm.archive lists, namespace. Those of you who have built archive controls, you knows what I'm talking about. That's where you're going to find this interface. The changes basically is we're eliminating scripts altogether. So no longer are you writing function, whatever, end function. We're implementing that stuff inside a compiled assembly that gets loaded when SuperOffice runs. I'm going to go in excruciating depth about this in the next 30 minutes. But basically I'm showing you the differences in the workflow between the new system and the old system. So you've got an archive control, invokes an archive provider, populates the control from a specified data source. It invokes the interface in order to get the rows, or the archive provider to populate the control, but then it invokes the methods that you've assigned to the add capability, the edit capability, the delete capability, as well as invoking any actions that you've defined inside the menu system. No longer are there scripts. It's all running in context with the archive provider. if you've got them in the same assembly. Update your information, control returns back to the control. And it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit easier to work with, and I'll tell you, it's a heck of a lot easier to debug, because then you can step right through your code. We don't have a debugger for our scripts. You can't debug through those things inside SuperOffice, but you can debug inside this new archive system interface for interaction. So how does this work? First, you're going to see a consolidation of information. Now the events, the context menus, and the toolbars are all defined inside a single location. They're defined inside this assembly, right? They're defined using this iArchive control event handler interface. We're going to take a look at that. We still have the custom archive configuration config. That's not going anywhere. We still have to have SOCRM custom archives folder inside the SuperOffice installation directory. But what that looks like is significantly different. Do you see the differences? It's a lot smaller. It's a lot cleaner. We're defining more information actually in the interface and not inside the configuration. We're getting rid of a lot of those things and then being able to discover them at runtime using attributes and other mechanisms within inside. It's all .NET stuff basically. Leverage that. We can still define restrictions. There's the provider name, the GUI name, the host name. None of that's changed. The restrictions are still there. All right, I kind of hinted on that there was something new. Here's, for example, a row count, where I can basically say, use it almost as like a paging system, sort of. Not really a page, but it's more of a limiting system. For the view, still specifying the view and the capabilities that I am able to take advantage of when I'm debugging. The toolbar is here as well. Export equals true is, if you got that export to Excel button showing up or not. And then my columns are still defined here. But all that information about the events, the everything that we have here, so the context menus and the toolbar, all of that's defined inside the actual assembly. Here's what the iArchive control event handler interface looks like. It's quite large. Could have been broken down into two interfaces, but we figured it would be a lot simpler for you to do it into one. The actions that take place inside this control, or inside this, the class that implements this interface, is going to be two things. What happens when this archive control is invoked? What am I going to show? And then basically what happens when I interact with that control. Add row. What happens when I want to add a row and I click on the add button? That's going to pass in a restriction, which is basically the current of what I'm looking at. Person ID equals 2. If my entity is in fact a person, it'll pass that in. What's the current system like? Can add row is a very powerful mechanism where it allows you to enable or disable the add button based on some rules engine that you define. There's no interface for the rules engine, but can I add a row? Well, let's look at your rights, for example. Do you have the can I add a product right? And if you do, well then enable that button. Otherwise, for all those users, disable it. Delete rows. This gets interesting. This gets to the point where we show where we're headed, but not quite where we are. Where we are is when you call delete rows, we'll only pass you in a single row. And that's because inside this archive control, you're only allowed to click a single row. Today I can't click 5 rows. Right-click on the context menu and say, invoke some action like add or delete or print. I can only do 1 row at a time today. But because I'm passing in an array of row info types, it should show you a little bit of where we're heading into the future so that we will provide that capability in the future. Edit row passes in row information. What is a row information? It's information about that row, that record that you have highlighted. The data type for that looks like this. It's a link hint, a row key, and a row type. Your row type is the entity. It's the person. It's the sale. It's a string representation of what I'm looking at. Is it an appointment? It'll say appointment. If it's a company, it'll say contact. If it's a person, it'll say person. If it's an invoice, it'll say invoice, if that's what you've defined inside your archive provider. The row key is the primary key for that record. And then the link hint, Sean, I was talking there, I was going to answer your question a little bit. This is where we define how we navigate or what dialog is going to open up inside the Win client, is we specify that inside the link hint. The link hint is like, whoa, what is that? It's kind of like some bogus gray term. But it's like a hyperlink of a hint that hints to the application of what I want you to do when you invoke this row. So it's a link hint. Inside a link hint, I set that inside my archive provider in a very specific way. You can think about a link hint as being, first and foremost, where do I want to navigate to in my application? The second part is, what are the parameters, or what are the properties, the values that I want to pass into that invocation? The nav is actually a coined term that's in your archive provider, says nav equals, and then generally it's an entity name or a page that you want to show inside. When you click on that, if I say person, it will invoke the person dialog. Okay? This is all documented. There are examples of what this link hint looks like when it's populated inside the SDK. It's inside the articles on DevNet. I'm not going to get into it here. I want to focus on the extensibility aspects of this archive system. Not get into the nitty-gritty details, but just show you all the moving parts. And yeah. So I'm just trying to answer Shalom's question in there. So past header rows, we get into the other aspect of the archive control that we're talking about. It talks about what's available, what's provided, and then also about what actions you can take. Get button items will return an array of archive restriction infos? No. Row action item infos. And this is a data type that basically defines either a menu or a button. But basically, the key to remember is that it's a generic type because we want the ability to enable it or disable it and put that control into your hands. So, for the same reasons I talked about before, check the data user rights. If he's got this data right, then I'll enable that button, or I'll enable that menu item, or I'll disable either one of those. I'm going to show you what that looks like in code as well. Get image. This is for the future. It's not implemented yet, but it's for future implementation. Get menu items will get similar to the button items. Return an array of row action items that are the menus, as well as each one of these have a child item as well. Child items property. This is a row action item info. This specifies, again, a menu item or a button, and the possible interactions I can have with that little control. Can I execute? Can execute means whether or not you can actually invoke or click that button or click that menu item. Child items is only relevant to menu items. You can't have child buttons on a button, but you can have child menus on a menu. Disable icon hint and enable icon hint are for future implementation. Basically, this is, what do I want that image to look like when it's enabled? What do I want that image to look like when it's disabled? When we have the image capability on a button or a menu item. The display name is the text that you're going to see in the control. The display tooltip when you hover over it. The execute delegate, the execute method will invoke a method that you specified implements the execute delegate prototype, and if it's an add or a delete or a print or whatever that method is that you define in this place, it will invoke that action. It will also, within that execute delegate method, pass you or have context of where you are, what information you're looking at, so that you have full sort of 360 view of, again, where you are inside the application. The name is the ID of the row action item info. Script action is also reserved for future use. When we were talking about this, we want the ability to define one type of IR control event handler interface, class that implements that, and then be able to run it both in Windows and in web. So again, this is for future consideration. Should we get looking at some code? We've got about 30 minutes left. This is the absolute positive highlight of this entire presentation. Keep your eye on the ball. You know you don't want to see that again. All right. Everybody's awake again? Okay. Where to begin? So many possibilities. But let's start with the archive provider, because basically, ultimately, we have to have a data source. And I'm not going to be creative. I'm not defining an invoice, I'm not defining products. I don't want to get lost in that picture of what I'm trying to show you. Okay? I'm basically going to call up this cool little provider created by Conrad, unfortunately, who couldn't be here to give this presentation, who's about to become a grandfather again. And it's called the generate rows. And this archive provider will basically just generate rows with entities of type either even or odd. Quite simple. Is it an even row or is it an odd row? And as you can imagine, it changes with each one. So looking at this archive provider, look at the standard things that we need to implement. We need to be able to specify what columns are going to be returned from this provider. Every provider returns columns, right? So in this case, we're going to define one here called row number. We're going to define a column called text.
Are we supposed to be able to see some of that now?
Yes. You're absolutely positive we should. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Here's the archive provider. It's called generate rows. As we come down, we're going to look at the column definitions inside here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Here are the columns. Column row number, and we get text. And we get dates, and we get binary date, and that's about it. So we're returning 4 columns. Number, dates, text, binary date. Inside the constructor, this is actually something that we do for every archive provider. If you use the code generator in order to create an archive provider for you, it will write code very similar to this. We use a column helper, passing in the instance of this class so that you can use reflection in order to pick up these columns and make those available through the get available columns method. If we want to say get available entities, we're not actually going to return anything. We're not going to show any checkboxes in our archive control. But if we wanted to, we would define those here. We're going to just keep it simple. Set the desired columns. When I choose right click and say configure columns, and I select the columns that I want to show in my archive control, when I click on OK on that button, it invokes set desired columns and basically tells the provider what information you want to return. Set desired entities is not implemented because we're not actually going to invoke, check any checkbox to invoke and then to get back an entity. Just some local properties for this provider to run. We call set restrictions. Set restrictions, basically, when that archive provider is under an invocation, and we call set restrictions based on the current context of the application, based on the parameters I defined inside of that custom configuration file. Remember, we had that section called restrictions, and where I said we could actually populate that with template variables, which would be, be replaced by the current system. Set restrictions is called here, and then basically I capture that information and it allows me to work with it. Let me go ahead and just remind you about what that restriction looked like. Here's that restriction in the configuration file. In this case, I'm setting a row count. There's another restriction called start date, and another one called timestamp. And I am using this set restriction method to pass that information to the configuration file. I'm going to capture that information, say a new date, time span. I'm actually not even taking that from the restriction, so it's even simpler than that. But that is how the information defined inside the archive configuration file gets persisted down here into the archive provider. Here I'm going to look, see if the start date, time span, the row key, and other properties. I don't want to focus on this information because basically, again, all I'm doing is populating it with dummy data, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Paging, we're not using paging. We're not returning any results about how many rows we have to return. But we are going to, every archive provider, how do you actually get information inside the archive control? It's based on this method, get rows. Right? Every archive provider returns a list of archive rows, which are the records that you see inside that control. So we're going to aggregate that information out. When we're talking about row types, there's basically the entities. Here's my on, here's my even. Style hint for actually what I want that row to be displayed as. Style hints allow you to add color, right? This is how former employees become red, or was it no mail records become blue, how you can have them italicized or gray, things of that nature. And you can define these colors inside your configuration file. You define a style in your configuration file, and then you can leverage it here inside the code, and it will automatically, when the archive control displays that information, it will look at the style hint and format it in that way that you've defined. Okay. When I say, if you say configure columns, we use the helper basically. It's just picking out random sort of very useful pieces of information. The column helper has built-in functions that make it very useful and helpful when building up basically the result set. So when I say configure columns, set desired columns, I go through, and if I only say give me 2 out of the 4 possible columns that my archive provider returns, I can filter out additional columns by seeing if this actually wants that column. I can check and call want any column, pass in that column information, and if it's not wanted, because it knows, because I've set that in my desired columns method, it will filter that out, and it won't add that to the returning archive row. There we go, we get into the other aspect of this. Up here, we had even, I think we had on. Okay, and that's basically it. Archive provider, the most important methods. I guess we can just go up to the top. Keys are over here. In the archive provider interface, we have a few different other interfaces that we're going to learn from. Get result information basically allows you to define how many records that this has to display. It will show you in the number box of number of columns. Get rows invokes in order to return that information. and then set paging information, give me like the first 10 out of 50, for example. All of this is very well defined and documented and actually videotaped. Mnemonic did a very, very good session about this 3 Expander Worlds ago. It's all up on the video library on the DevNet as well. So that's one of the underlying interfaces underneath our cloud provider that will basically get you back some rows. Here's the interface that will basically tell you whether or not, what are your columns, get the available columns, set the desired columns, order by, set the restriction. And also the last one for rows. The provider has entities. And what are the entities that this archive provider returns? Is it persons? Is it contacts? Is it appointments? Is it invoices? Is it product? Whatever. Okay. I'm about, what is this? 10 files into this. And they always say that if you go any further into 3 files, you've lost everybody. So let me try and get you back into where we're at. All we've done is look at the generic rows archive provider, gone a little bit too deep inside the archive provider interface, and let's just kind of back up. So all I basically want you to understand is that every archive provider has a limited number of functionality. It will basically tell you what entities, what models, what real types this thing returns to you. It also will be used in order to tell the archive provider what information you want returned. And what are the columns of information I want that this provider returns. It also allows you to say what the entities are that you want to find. Paging information, set the restrictions is probably very important because you don't want all the information possible in the database. You want to be able to filter it somehow, and that's what the archive restriction infos do. They allow you to set filters. Okay. Here's the dummy rows config file, which is the archive configuration now stored inside my SOCR and custom archives. Here's my dummy rows. That's the same information that is defined right here. It tells me that I want to invoke this provider called generate rows. It's given it a GUI name, just an identifier for that control, called contact rows. And then where I want to host it. I want to host this inside the contact archives. So I can see this on the contact part. It's passing in the restrictions to say, okay, I want no more than 123,456 records to return for or within this start date for this amount of time. And it allows me to set my debug information so I can enable my debug columns to see that control. I'll show you that. Column headers. And if I want to right-click up on the column headers so I can configure columns. Be able to make changes to my configuration file and then invoke reconfigure, and then view the data filter. I'll have an export bar. And then these are the columns that we saw defined inside an archive provider. Right? Date, row number, and text. I don't have to have all 4. You're not seeing the binary date there. So you don't have to define them all if you don't want them actually displayed. Whenever we write an archive provider and we want the ability to take advantage of it inside NetServer anywhere, including the Windows client, we have to load it somehow inside the context of NetServer. Does anybody know how we do that? How do we get this archive provider loaded inside NetServer? There's a configuration structure that you have to add.
SuperOffice config and the dynamic load.
Dynamic load section of the configuration file, the SuperOffice configuration file. Right? So I have a copy of that SuperOffice configuration file here. This is the one defined for my current running instance of SuperOffice. If I scroll down here and I look at the factory and dynamic load section, I'm adding in an element here for my custom archives. This is just a key. It can be called anything. Rumpelstiltskin, if you will. And that's okay. It's just so that it's not the same name as some other archive that's loaded inside that server. And then the actual name of the DLL that I have defined or compiled and is now laying inside the installation directory of SuperOffice. If I look at that folder, here's the configuration file. If I go out to the installation directory, I should be able to find that custom archives DLL here. So scroll down a little bit more. Anybody see it? There it is. Okay. Now that that resides there, if I had nothing in dynamic load and I started SuperOffice, it would completely ignore this DLL. Now that I've added it to dynamic load, when NetServer initializes, it's going to look at this section and say, oh, there's a DLL to load. Go ahead, assembly.load, and then have that capability to invoke whatever types that implement the interfaces that NetServer knows about. Okay, now that that's there, so there's my provider. Now I've got this event handler. I've got a class called GenerateRows Event Handler. It implements that iArchive archive control event handler interface. Yes? Now this is the one we were just talking about. So this class implements the do menu. Sorry, these are actually menu or methods that we've defined for those invoke. But we've got edit row. We've got get button items, get image, get menu items, has add button, has delete button, etc. We've implemented those, and let's see how that looks. When this interface, or the class that implements this interface, is invoked, it passes into the constructor the GUI name. Remember the GUI name, I said, was the identifier of that archive control inside the Windows client. So what I'm doing basically here is in the constructor, I'm passing it in saying, this is the archive control that I want you to handle. Okay? You're responsible for all the actions that can be invoked by this control. We also pass in the handle of the SuperOffice application. Right here. This is the parent H window, basically. So that in .NET, I can use that. If I'm going to show up a dialog, I show a dialog and I can pass into it the parent window. So this new window becomes a child of SuperOffice. So we don't have any of that, behind mixing up operations sort of thing. You got to put this out there now that I remember. When you show a dialog from an archive provider, an archive type that implements this interface, make sure that you invoke it as a mobile dialog. Okay? That way, the mobile dialog, it does not allow you to do anything else until that dialog is closed. The difference between mobile dialog and modeless is that it actually shows you, it's rendered. If it's modeless, then you can pretty much do anything. You can click on SuperOffice or you can click on Excel, and then the windows will switch. When you come back to SuperOffice, you'll see SuperOffice, but maybe the dialog is behind the SuperOffice. But if you invoke it as a mobile dialog, when you click back on SuperOffice, you'll see that dialog, and it won't be hidden behind anything. Okay? Let's not get into that nightmare. Mobile dialogs are your friends in this case. We always want you to invoke a mobile dialog. Alright, now that that horse is dead. Can add row. We return a field right here. We're passing you in an archive restriction, which allows you to check where you are. What's the context of your application? Do I have highlighted? Am I looking at a contact that I have rights to work with? Obviously, I'm going to have that that true, otherwise I wouldn't be able to see that contact. But maybe it's read only, for example. So I'll return field right. It can be read, update, delete, or full. And then when I click on the add button, it'll invoke this add button, which allows me to just go ahead and, in this case, I'm going to show a message box that shows you the information. But basically, I can create a new row somewhere deep down in my architecture, create a new row, persist that to the database, return an archive restriction, which gives me the new key of that record I just created. Right? I need that primary key. I'll return that to the control, which will invoke my provider, say get rows, where this entity equals this ID, and only that ID, and I'll add that record into the archive control. Understand? In the web world, this is very different. In the web world, what happens when I say add item, it's going to add that item always. It doesn't matter if it's an add, or an update, or a delete. It refreshes that archive control completely. And I'll share with you, this is kind of one of my pet peeves. So when I'm, 30 pages into some archive control, and I right-click and I choose Edit Information, after I've closed the dialog that I've edited that information in, what happens? It refreshes that control, goes to the top, and now I have to page down 30 things again. That's not very fun. But in this case, you don't worry about that because the Windows client is smart enough to be able to just insert that new row and you see it inside the control. Same thing with edit row. You return either null, nothing, which basically means don't update what you just showed me or what you just wanted to edit because maybe there was no edit changes. Or I can return the archive restriction again. It says, okay, I just updated this person where the person ID equals 3, therefore update all of the information for that, for what's being displayed inside that record at that time. Delete row allows me to just remove that record as well. Here, I'm actually saying can do menu item. And this is, we're talking about that execute delegate, for example. We basically hooked into the execute delegate for a menu item and said, for that menu item, and only that menu item, when you click on it, invoke this method, can do menu item 1. Let's see if I can find that one. Here we go. Get menu items. There's get button items and get menu items. And don't let the stacking of this array scare you. Basically, we're just returning an array of row action item infos, and we're building up basically a list of these menu items that we'll return. And then because the row action item is where that delegate is defined, I say, okay, for that invocation, when I invoke that button, I'm going to say the can execute method. This is going to be like the check if it's enabled or not, enabled or disabled. There's going to be can do menu item. And then the actual execute method is the do menu item method. Okay? This is a very standard sort of event handler in .NET. If you're used to working with Windows forms or even some ASP.NET web forms, when you drag a button onto the design surface, double click on it, what you're doing is you're enlisting to a delegate or assigning a method to be invoked when you click that control. That's exactly what we're doing here. It's no different. And so if you're used to working in those types of environments, which I know many of you are, this should just feel perfectly normal right at home. If anybody doing WPF development? So do I? Okay, I'll continue on. But basically, if you get into those types of environments, they have this thing called an iCommands interface, which allows you to invoke with all different types of controls. Anyways, it follows this very specific pattern. So you get used to that, you'll be right at home to this as well. Okay, so the button items are very similar as well. I'm getting a little bit low on time. So let's just kind of see what this is doing inside SuperOffice. Okay? You've looked at the archive provider. It's just returning a few records of generic information, generating rows, and then it's also basically handling the events that when we right-click and see context menus or click on the add or delete buttons. This class will go ahead and handle all of those actions. Looking inside SuperOffice, I'm looking at the company as contact. Here's the generate rows, one of the controls that I've defined. Basically, this is how fast you can load records without a database. All right. Here's the information. We'll return in the date, the row number, whether it's even or odd, and then styling that accordingly. Told you that we have add buttons. There's a delete one here, a button one here. It's enabled or disabled based on whether it's even or odd. So button 1 is good for even. Sorry, button 2 is good for even, button 1 is good for odd. It kind of makes sense, right? 1 and 2. If I want to invoke the edits method, I double click on this row, right? When I double click, it will invoke the edit method, and I don't remember if you recall, but inside that class, I showed a dialog. I invoked the dialog, I showed that dialog. And here that dialog is. Basically, it gives me the GUI name, again, the identifier of the control of where this information came from. It tells me what the entity is, the row type. It gives me the primary key of that, and here's that link in. Here in the Windows client, I don't take advantage of this nav I was talking about, navigation. Because here, when I click on this and I invoke this action, I can invoke as a protocol and navigate anywhere else and do pretty much any sort of navigation and open other dialogues. Within the context of .NET and full WinForms or WF, or it doesn't matter your display technology to be able to invoke that information. It's very important in the web world, though. Nav equals, and then that entity and page. Again, add button. If I want to add information, it's going to pass into me the context, set the restriction, to pass in a restriction of the current contact. It would be current contact equals, like in this case, 2 or 3. Right, add a new record. Want to delete that record? We'll go ahead and, are you sure you want to delete row number 6? Say yeah, and it's gone. Immediately. If I want to edit this, I'll say edit. We'll come back and say it was edited. No need to refresh the entire control. Right here. If I scroll down and I say edit this one, say edit, bam, I've edited it. There's no refresh to the control. Internally, it's something similar to, it's a little more complicated than that. There's this term called live update, TOR model. It's a little more intricate than this, but basically you get the ability to see the updated information immediately after you update it. Okay. Now we talked about a little bit about the debug capabilities here within this. So we have the capability to say, if I right-click here, I can say reconfigure. If I make any changes whatsoever inside my configuration file, I can just reconfigure. It goes out, it looks at that XML file, reloads it, goes through, parses it, looks at the information, and then redisplays that information. You see now none of that information that I can change, edit, or update is reflected. It's kind of refreshed that information. If I deleted any of the columns from there, it would have removed them from here as well. The field data viewer. This is that other window that I was telling you about that would show you all possible information that you would want to know about this archive provider and the rows that it was returned, or at least are capable of returning. You've got the entity name, basically that's the record that I was just sitting on, and then it gives me the table ID for the information. This is, we're going to go this at this point. The record ID was the ID of the record I was just working with. What are my rights information? What's the link hint, the provider name, the GUI name? Pref section, read the article if you want to know. The configurations are basically stored inside the preference system, and you can modify these if you want to, but it's not necessary. We actually don't want you to do that because if you make those changes, we'll detect those changes and update that information. But this stuff is stored basically cached, if you will. Yes, cached? Okay, good. Here are the available columns and the basic definition of what these columns are. Here's the name, so date, the row number, the text, the display name, display type, restriction, if there's restrictions associated with it. You have the capability to tell me if a specific column can be sorted by, if it can be set a restriction by, those types of information. And we'll also see that here as well. Some column information down here kind of summarizing what we're looking at. It's just an added ability for you to drill into your information. I got about a minute left. I want to show you this one additional archive provider that we've created here. And it's called the Set Restrictions or Show Restrictions Provider. Very simply, it's displaying some information. The columns, it shows you about the restriction. It shows you what's the name of the column and what's the comparer and what's the value. And then we can use this, and I've set it in a configuration file to be loaded in the mini panel. If you look at the dummy rows config file, here it is, just down below. Generate rows, generate rows, generate rows. Finally, show restrictions. Here's the provider name. Show restrictions. Set this up inside the mini preview show restrictions panel. Mini preview panel. With these following information. What's some additional information? Basically, what is the restriction types? When I look at this inside SuperOffice, this allows me to debug, basically the current system. You know how today inside the Windows client, if I want to check out what the currents are, I either have to subscribe to the server events and listen for when contact change or appointment change, and then show a message box or show that in some sort of dialogue what the value is for that contact. Well, now using the provider system, I can just load that up here inside the menu panel, and it will show me for the associate. My associate ID is 1. And I'm looking at person ID of 8 was the last person. If I come to projects, it will show me what the current is for projects. There's only one there. If I come into sales, it will show me the sale ID. And it's not a very big database. There's the person ID, right? That updates that 8 and 9. Okay, so you can leverage this for additional debugging purposes. And basically, it's just another, not a realistic sort of archive provider that you would use in the real world, but it's something that you can sort of use as a launch point to see how it can be leveraged inside SuperOffice. If we go to selections, if we have a dynamic selection, there's a little trick that if you shift control and click on the add button, it will show you this criteria viewer window. Monica's like, no! Don't show them that! No! I have Conrad's blessing, that's all I'm going to say. But basically, what this is showing me is, today it's only available through if it's a dynamic selection. But I have kind of been led to believe that this is going to be available everywhere there's an archive provider. There will be some sort of Easter egg key combination that I can do. Click on it and bring up this window, and it shows me what columns available through that archive provider that I can actually set a restriction on. Okay? It ignores the ones where I can't actually set a restriction on. Okay? And it tells me all the possible information about that. Look at the name of that column, side of the encoded display name, if you will. A little bit more information over here to the right. The restriction type, if it's a list, the list name, sort of thing. So again, this is just inside the, if it's a dynamic selection today, but it's going to be prevalent for troubleshooting throughout the system in later versions. Look for more in 7, for example, a bit later. Last summer, by this time next year, maybe, if we're lucky. Don't quote me on that. Okay. That's a lot of information to go through. I've pretty much gone through a hurricane of information. So we've looked at the archive system, the archive providers that populate the archive controls. We talked about how that information is basically collected, aggregated, transformed, and displayed. We talked about how this is prevalent throughout all of SuperOffice. This is the data workflow. Web panels are great, and you can do all kinds of magical things there. But again, you're missing some of the key components. When you're working in web world, you know there are certain things you can't do, like open a document, for example. There are other things that you can't do from a web panel that you can when you're in the full context of SuperOffice. You have the full capability, breadth of the application's information available to you. That's powerful. And this is true both for the web and for the win. And this is really, really, really where we want you to go with your integrations and extensibilities of the SuperOffice application into the future. We're still going to support web forms or web frames, web panels. Those are still there. They're not going anywhere. But I'm telling you, work with this information, your users are going to get much more SuperOffice look and feel. You get the look and feel for free. When SuperOffice 8 comes, that information will still be there, it will still work, it will look like the new application. You won't have to redo all of your controls and things like that. So you'll just adapt. So there's a lot of things to take advantage of with what we've put into 7. And with the changes with the compiled assemblies information we put for overriding our archive control event handler inside an assembly instead of the configuration file of the scripting system. And some of the things I'm going to talk about tomorrow, you'll see where we're heading in the long term for this. This is exciting times because there's a lot of really cool things that are going on with NetServer integrated inside SuperOffice. Yeah. Kind of hinted on that for tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about the easier deployment capabilities with the dynamic assembly storage. We haven't really worked all that out yet. This is like putty, right? It's there. People are feeling it, starting getting used to it inside R&D. But you can bet my bottom that I'll be pushing this sort of capability into it. Yes, Mike?
I don't know.
Okay. Please remember to voice your opinions about anything you've seen in this presentation, as well as everything that you've seen earlier today, and things that you're going to see tomorrow. Please go to devnet.superoffice.com/eval, fill in your information. Be a gentleman, gentlewoman. Do not, fill out a critique about a session that is happening at some point in the future. It's there for you to do that. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I would very much like to have this example in source code. Is it on that? This example.
Not yet, but this is everything that you see here at this event is going to be available for download on DevNet within the week.
Okay, this was a very clear example, so then I have no further questions.
Yes, you modify the dynamic load, you copy the file into the SOCRM custom archives folder, load the assembly in after it's compiled, and bam. And another thing, I didn't get a chance to show you, but let's say I am in here, right? I'm just going to come out of this for a second. And here's my assembly. I click on play. I've got this hooked up so that when this compiles the DLL, it will actually launch SuperOffice, right? So now SuperOffice is launched. And if I click any of these buttons, let's see if I go back to company, and if I set a breakpoint onto my archive control, for my anyone who used to do event handlers. Can do menu item. Well, that will get invoked. Right? This the breakpoint is set. I want to show this dialog for when I want to delete a row. Come back inside SuperOffice. If I can click on generate rows, find one that I can click delete, get delete. That didn't break, did it? I expected that to. I guess it's because SuperOffice has already started. If I shut this down and then start it from here, it will go ahead and look into it. And just compile.
It would just be nice if the same little event could be available on the custom archive if there was data in that context.
Okay, so if we had a column defined as a icon column, icon type, so that we could actually display a picture inside that record.
On actually on the description of the archive, where all the pages are.
Yes, I am.
Never mind.
Mike, you following?
No.
I don't get
We're on the archive control, yes?
Yeah.
We're on a record inside the archive control or a
on
button? The header?
well, the other archives are.
Tab.
The tab, yeah.
Okay.
If the little icon on the tab, the little icon showing whether there's something on the page where if you already done.
Right, like a note,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
Or a pin. Yeah, or
Pin.
yeah.
No, we don't have that. Web, on the other hand, is a different story, where the web is pretty much whatever you want goes. And you can do that, and there's how web does it. You can do it inside Twin, or in web on your own tabs as well. Mark?
One relevant point may be that until you actually click on the tab, the archive provider and the archive doesn't actually get loaded or invoked. So, we are not looking inside, we don't know what's inside until the user clicks it. So that in the places where you see these funny little pictures saying there's something interesting, it's because the tab control itself is fetching something from somewhere to determine whether to put that picture. It's not because the archive inside the tab is saying something. Because if we actually invoked every archive in the background, it would take too long.
So when I said, so the question was, let me just go ahead and say this out loud so it gets on film if anybody else ever has the same question. Is it possible to show an icon on the tab based on information that's contained within the archive control itself? Modest explanation is no, because there's no code that's being executed when this archive control is loaded to check for this possible other conditions. So if, for example, at some point in the future we had this interface, additional interface that said, check for icon, will icon be displayed or whatever it is, then you could execute some code, go off and query to see if that information, the criteria is met to show that icon or to show whatever icon. So that is not currently in there. In the web world, on the other hand, you have that capability to hook into those sort of things when those controls are being rendered, just like the web does as well. Cap locks. Why didn't anybody just remind me about cap locks? So we're trying to invoke a deletes here. Now we're in the debugger. Deletes invokes. And here we are, we're getting into full context of Visual Studio. It's a full debugging experience. Here comes in the archive row that was selected, and all of the information about that row. Thank you. Any more questions?
So actually, when you have created your very custom archive, how do you distribute it to the end users?
So today, there's MSI.
Okay.
And basically, you have to see if that SO custom archives folder exists inside program directories, which is locked down, so it has to be set up through some sort of group policy in the side, Azure, whatever was it, PowerShell nowadays. And then put your custom archive configuration definition in that folder, and then copy the assembly into the installation directory of SuperOffice. Then it will run. To debug it, then you want to just set the developer mode inside admin to get that new menu item and the right click to see the configure or show the data field. Three things: the folder, the file, and the DLL. That's in the folder. Yes, dynamic load. Sorry. Yes, thank you. Update the dynamic load section of the SuperOffice configuration file, of course. Any other questions? Great. If you have any luggage, bags here with you, please take them with you now, because if it's left behind, it's most likely going to get disposed of. They're going to take the wall down now, they're going to come in and they're going to set up all the tables for the dinner. So now when we leave, we're going to go out into the exhibition area and social hour.